Then we come to chapter 44. And most of this is just history. We can go through it quickly. He told his house steward to fill the men's sacks with food as much as they can carry. Put each man's money again in the mouth of his sack, he said, and put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, and his money for the grain. And he did as Joseph told him. And as soon as they had just gone out of the city, Joseph said to his house steward, verse 4, follow after them. When you overtake them, say, why have you repaid evil for good? Why have you stolen my Lord's cup? And they overtook them, and they said, no, we have not stolen any such thing. And if anyone has stolen it, we will be your Lord's slaves, verse 9. And so they opened their sack, and they began to search, and the cup was found, verse 12, in Benjamin's sack. Of course, they didn't know how it came there. They tore their clothes and returned to the city. And you see here Judah's attitude. When Judah came there, verse 14, and fell to the ground, what is this deed that you have done? And notice, of course, Judah could have said, but we never stole that. We don't know how it came into our bag. But he doesn't say anything like that. He says, how can we justify ourselves? Verse 16, God has found out the iniquity of our servants. Both we and the one in whose possession the cup is being found, we are your slaves from now on. But Joseph said no. And here we can say that Joseph was testing those 10 brothers again. He said, far be it from me to do this. I don't want all of you to be slaves. But the one in whose possession the cup is being found, that was Benjamin, he shall be my slave. The rest of you go up in peace to my father. Now these were the 10 brothers who once upon a time were glad to get rid of Joseph and just seek their own. And now Joseph was testing them to see when another younger brother, Benjamin, is in a difficult situation now. Let me see what your attitude will be towards him. Will it be the same attitude that you had towards me nearly 20 years ago? Or have you folks changed a bit? You see, if he had seen that, oh well, that's all right, if they said that's all right, let Benjamin be put in jail here, we'll go back home, then he would have seen that their attitude hasn't changed one bit. But we can see their attitude had changed. Because Judah approached him, and Judah was the one, if you remember, in chapter 37, who said, let's sell this Joseph to the Ishmaelites, in 37 verse 26 and 27. That was Judah, who said, let's sell him off to the Ishmaelites, get rid of him. Now the same Judah, after more than 20 years, he says, please, don't be angry with me, you're equal to Pharaoh, let me say a few words to you. We have an old father, verse 20, and a little child of his old age. Of course, Benjamin was not a child. Joseph must have been around 39 by now, and Benjamin perhaps 35 or so. We read in another chapter that he was married and he had 10 children, Benjamin. But he was the youngest, and in that sense the father's little child. And yes, his father loves him. And when we said that we cannot go without him, our father was very disturbed, he says. And finally he agreed. And if we go back now without him, our father, verse 29, will come, with gray hairs, will come down to Sheol in sorrow. And so he says, verse 33, therefore please, let me, that is your servant, remain instead of the lad. You see the difference there? The same Judah who 22 years ago was glad to get rid of Joseph, sell him off to the Ishmaelites. Now he is so changed. He says, let me stay. And let Benjamin go. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest I see the evil that would overtake my father? He never thought like that 22 years earlier, how he could go back to his father and tell him a lie that Joseph had been slain by wild beasts. But he has changed. That's a good thing if God has been able to do a work so that hard-hearted people have changed and become soft. Then it was obvious to Joseph that these brothers have really changed. They're not the same old people who will get rid of their younger brother and seek their own. They're now so concerned about their younger brother that the same Judah is willing to go into jail in order to let the younger brother go. And then Joseph could not control himself. Have everyone go out from me, he says. And there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. This is a very beautiful picture of Christ making himself known to the Jews when he comes again in glory. The whole history of Joseph, as we saw, is a picture of Christ who came to his own. He came to the field to look for his brothers. We read in Genesis 37, and Jesus came to the Jews. He came to his own. But his own did not receive him. They sold him for 30 pieces of silver, just like they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. But God raised up Joseph to a high position, and God has raised up Christ. But Joseph's brothers did not recognize him, and the Jews don't recognize Christ as their Messiah yet. But a day will come when he will return in glory. And it says in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, that they shall look on me, whom they have pierced. Then they will weep. And so this phrase that Joseph made himself known is a picture of that day when Jesus will make himself known to the God-fearing among the Jews, that they will see that the one whom they rejected and sold was really the Messiah. And he wept so loudly, the Egyptians heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. And then Joseph said to his brothers, please come closer to me. He said, I am your brother, Joseph. And then he uses a phrase 3 times, which is the phrase we read in Psalm 105. He says, don't be grieved or angry with yourself because you sold me here. God sent me. That's the phrase. It's amazing when you think that long before Romans 8:28 was written, without any Bible in his hands, without attending any meetings, as far as we know, for 20 years he had been in Egypt by now. He had no contact with God-fearing people. 20 years. He was 17 when he was sold. He's 39 now. More than 20 years. And he's kept himself pure, without fellowship, without exhortation, without a Bible. He's lived in the fear of God. Tremendous example. For young people who may be living alone in a place where there's no one to encourage them and no one to see them if they sin. He kept himself pure. He so cleansed himself of any bitterness or an unforgiving spirit that when he sees his brothers, he says, don't feel sorry for what you did. You may have had wrong intentions, but God sent me. It wasn't you who sold me to the Ishmaelites. It was God. Just like Jesus said to his disciples when they tried to defend him with the sword, when the soldiers came to capture Jesus in Gethsemane, he says, the cup which my Father has given me, not Judas Iscariot, the cup which my Father has given me, shall I not drink it? It's amazing that Joseph, living way back there at the beginning, had that light and understanding. It just teaches us one thing, brothers and sisters, that it's possible to have a knowledge of God even without contact with other God-fearing people if we are wholehearted and God-fearing ourselves. To know these truths, it's possible to know them. And Joseph's life is an example of that God can sovereignly make the evil that other people do to work for our good. God sent me, he says. Again in verse 7, God sent me. Again in verse 8, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Very clearly, it was not you. You may have sold me to the Ishmaelites. You thought you were sending me here. God sent me. What conviction. And that is why it was easy for him to forgive. Why is it so difficult for us to forgive someone who has harmed us? Because we don't see God in that situation. Our eyes are focused on that person, and the devil magnifies that person's image before our eyes who has done us harm. And there we can be put to shame by Joseph. To be able to say it was not he who did that. It was God who allowed that. Not he. So that I don't allow the devil to show that person through a magnifying glass to me. Not he. God. Think how David could say when Shimei cursed him, when Absalom had usurped the throne and thrown David out, and Shimei cursed him, saying, now God is judging you for your taking the kingdom from Saul. Somebody, one of David's party, like Peter, said, let me go and chop off that fellow's head. David said, no. If God has permitted him to curse me, why should I object? Do we have the faith that Joseph and David had? If God has permitted that man to speak to me like this, why should I fight with God? If God has permitted that person to treat me like this, why should I fight with God? It is not that person, it's God. If only we can say what David and what Joseph said here. It was not you, it was God who sent me. It's amazing how we can know so much of Scripture and hear about these things again and again and again in the church, and yet not come to the faith that Joseph had, which teaches us it is not a matter of intellectual understanding. It's a question of fearing God in our heart. If we fear God in our heart, we will know the truth. If we don't fear God in our heart, even if we hear it again and again and again in the meetings, it will not make an impression on our lives. Joseph feared God. He kept himself pure when he was tempted in the time of temptation. That's why he got a revelation from God. That God allowed these things. And so he could say to them, don't be angry. God sent me. God sent me to preserve a remnant in the earth with a purpose, to keep you alive. It was not you who sent me. Verse 8, He has made me a father to Pharaoh. Amazing. That God took that young man, made me a father to Pharaoh means like a father gives advice to his sons as to how to conduct themselves. Joseph became the one who was advising Pharaoh as to how to solve the problems of Egypt. It's amazing what God can do through one man, if He can find one man who is faithful. I want to emphasize what we considered in our last study. While the world looks for numbers, a lot of Christians think that by numbers we can impress people. People ask, how many people in your church? 100. Oh, that's a good number. That is all carnal. Think if you had to say, there are only 2 people in our church. If they are wholehearted, like Joseph, that's better than 100 people who are not wholehearted like Joseph. We have to train our mind away from thinking like in worldly terms, that numbers makes an impression before God. If we are impressed because the chairs are full, we don't know God yet. We certainly don't know God yet. Man looks on the outward appearance. God needed only one man in Egypt, in the world's most powerful country in those days, Egypt. He needed only one man. He didn't need 100. One man. It's always been like that with God. But that man has to be faithful. One faithful man can accomplish a tremendous amount for God. And I really long with all my heart that particularly you younger brothers and sisters will be gripped by this truth. With many who are older, many have missed the bus. They have taken it easy in their younger days. But with many of you who are younger, just make sure you don't miss the bus. Make sure that you're going to be faithful in your youth, so that you can be that one person who can influence multitudes for God, particularly in the days of famine that are going to increase as we approach the end. So he says, hurry up and go to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Notice there again, the emphasis is humility. He doesn't say that Pharaoh found me to be a very smart, clever person. No. Not a word about how he interprets Pharaoh's dream and giving a testimony. I'll tell you now how I came to this position and glorifying himself. None of all that. His humility. He says, God made me, gave me this position. God sent me here. God gave me this position, and this position has been given to me to serve others. Not for me to sit on a great throne and enjoy myself, but to serve others, to preserve a remnant in the earth, verse 7. Think of that phrase. God has sent me to preserve a remnant in the earth. That's our calling. God has sent us to preserve a remnant for Him in the days of famine. A remnant who hear not just dry expositions of Scripture, but the prophetic words of the Lord. God has sent me. God has given me this position. And so he says, come down and do not delay. And you will live in the land of Goshen, verse 10. You shall be near me, you and your children. There I will also provide for you. There are still 5 years of famine to come, lest you and your household and all that you have be impoverished. Your eyes see and the eyes of my brothers see. It's my mouth which is speaking to you. Verse 13. Now you must tell my father of all my splendor and bring my father down here. There again, when we look at Joseph as a picture of Christ, we see something very beautiful of the Spirit of Christ there, that what Joseph was enjoying, he did not want to enjoy alone. He wanted his brothers to share that. There was no selfishness there. There was no saying, oh well, God's given me this position. I've been faithful, therefore God's given me this and I can enjoy myself. Well, those fellows were unfaithful, just too bad. No. He did not want to enjoy something which he could not share with his brothers. Think of that phrase. He did not want to enjoy something which he could not share with his brothers. That is the Spirit of Christ. He did not want to enjoy something in heaven which he didn't want to share with us. He wanted to share it with us. In fact, he wanted to share it so much with us that he came down and died for us, that we might share what he has in heaven. That, my brothers, is the Spirit of Christ. Is the exact opposite of the spirit of Adam, which is, if I got something, that's for me. That's for me and my family to enjoy. Forget about the others. And that's not the Spirit of Christ. Joseph did not want to have something which he couldn't share with his brothers. And the more we partake of the Spirit of Christ, that we cannot share with others who are the brothers of Jesus Christ. This is the divine nature, the exact opposite of selfishness. All that he has, he wanted us to have. That's the Spirit of Christ. There we can see what a lot of selfishness dwells in our flesh. Tremendous amount of selfishness. And we see here further, then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck, verse 14, and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers and wept on them, and afterward his brothers talked with him. When the news was heard in Pharaoh's house that Joseph's brothers had come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your beasts and go to the land of Canaan. And take your father and your households and come to me, and I'll give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat the fat of the land. You see, because this one man's faithfulness, all his family was blessed. And that's another spiritual principle. That when God finds one man in a family faithful to Him, that man, God's intention is that through that man, He blesses that whole family. And that should be a challenge to us. That by our faithfulness, even if our families initially misunderstand us and despise us, it doesn't matter. One day, God will bless our families because of our faithfulness, if we are really faithful. That's something to think about. In verse 20 he says, "Don't concern yourself with goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours." Think of that attitude. Joseph wanted to give the best to those who had given the worst to him 20 years earlier. That is true spirituality. To want to give the best to those who, when they had power over us, gave us the worst. What a spirit. Not just to forgive them. This is way beyond forgiveness. This is a longing to do the very best for those who've done the very worst they could towards us. Verse 30:21, "Then the sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons according to the command of Pharaoh, and gave them changes of garments, 100, and to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces," verse 22, 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments. And he sent 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt to his father, grain and bread and sustenance. And then he gives them an exhortation as they go. And so he sent his brothers away, verse 24, "And as they departed he said to them, 'Do not quarrel on the journey.'" He knew the tendency these people have to quarrel with each other, because they have to go back now and tell Jacob what? That Joseph is in Egypt. And Jacob say, "Hey, I thought you fellows said that he'd been killed by an animal." And then they have to confess their sin of 22 years earlier. And on the way they'll have to discuss who will take the blame for this. And then they can get into a quarrel. He says, "Now don't quarrel on the journey." Think of that little exhortation of Joseph's, and I want to exhort each of you to take it as an exhortation for life's journey. Don't quarrel with anyone on life's journey. Seek the way of peace. Be like Joseph, not like his 10 brothers who had a reputation for quarreling, that they need such an exhortation. It's a sad thing if we have a reputation for quarreling, that such an exhortation has to be given. That's a closing exhortation. As you go, don't quarrel, because I know you folks have a tendency to quarrel with each other. Dear brothers and sisters, we really need to cleanse ourselves so that we have a testimony that it is impossible to quarrel with me. Impossible. Impossible to get me offended, first of all. Whatever you may do, whatever you may say, whatever you may not do, whatever you may not say, you cannot get me to be offended. You can try anything you like. I've finished with that. Getting offended, impossible. Quarreling with you, impossible. That is the testimony of one who is walking the new and living way. Because it takes 2 people to quarrel, and if you refuse, that's the end of the quarrel. That is very important that all of us have such a testimony. And then we read further, and they came back to Jacob and they said, "Joseph is still alive. Indeed, he is ruler over all the land of Egypt." But he was stunned, for he did not believe them. Like the Jews today, do not believe that Jesus is exalted above all things. When they told him all the works of Joseph, he had spoken to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent, then he believed. He said, "It is enough. My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die."